Hello, I'm Ed Murphy with the Astronomy Department at the University of Virginia, and this is Astronomy 1210, Introduction to the Sky and Solar System, Lecture 16, Ancient Astronomy. Now that we've studied some basic motions in the sky, such as the seasons and the phases of the moon, we're going to move on to our study of the history of astronomy. And we'll begin our study of the history of astronomy by studying some of the oldest and most ancient astronomical sites in the world. Now, there's a whole field dedicated to this called archaeoastronomy, and we don't have the time to go into all the details of all the astronomical sites around the world. So I've picked just three primary ones that I would like to talk about, and I picked them for a reason. First of all three of them are quite famous. You probably have heard of all three of them. The second thing is they're all relatively easy to get to. And so as you travel this world and you find yourself in the vicinity of one of these ancient astronomical monuments, I hope that you will take a day to get away and get to this monument and study a bit about the people who built it, the reasons that they built it, and the astronomy that went on there. So let's begin our study of ancient astronomy with, of course, Stonehenge. Stonehenge is located in southern England, just west of London. So let's bring up Google Earth right here. All right, so we've got Google Earth that's centered on Charlottesville right now. So the first place that we want to study is Stonehenge. All right, just to scan out a little bit here for a second. So, Stonehenge is located in southern England, about a 2-hour drive from London, and it is well worth going to see the ancient site of Stonehenge. Now, today we know that Stonehenge isn't isolated. Surrounding it are dozens of other ancient monuments, pits, roadways, even possibly villages, lots and lots of ancient burials in the area. So Stonehenge itself is not completely isolated. But let's talk a bit more about Stonehenge and its astronomical uses. So the first astronomical use I want you to think about is this. Did the Bronze Age builders of Stonehenge use it to calculate the times of lunar and solar eclipses? So answer true if you believe that they did use it to calculate the times of lunar and solar eclipses, and false if you believe that they did not. Go ahead, head over to Learning Catalytics, take about 30 seconds or so to answer that, and then come right back. All right, welcome back. So the question is, did the builders of Stonehenge use it to calculate the times of lunar and solar eclipses? And the answer to that is, frankly, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is that the builders of Stonehenge did not leave us an instruction manual on how to use it, or even leave us any indication of how Stonehenge itself was used. Now, we will see one well-known astronomical alignment inside of Stonehenge, but the purposes of the Aubrey holes located in this ditch out here and all the stones on the inside, there may have been many other astronomical alignments that are lost to us over time. People have proposed that wooden posts stuck in these holes could have been used to make observations of the moon, and they could have. And those observations may have allowed them to predict when eclipses would occur, but I think it's very unlikely. We have no other evidence that the people who built Stonehenge had an astronomy that was sophisticated enough to know, to be able to predict when eclipses would occur, especially solar eclipses, but even lunar eclipses. So we don't know whether they used Stonehenge for that purpose or not. We will, however, see the one purpose that we do know that they used it for. So first of all, let's talk about the construction of Stonehenge. Stonehenge is an interesting monument because, first of all, it is incredibly ancient. The first construction there took place about 10,000 years ago. And the first construction that was built there were post holes that are in what is, used to be the parking lot. It is no longer the parking lot. And they're lined up in an east-west alignment. And they were dated to about 8,000 BCE. But the Stonehenge monument that we think of today, construction began around 3100 BC. And the first construction was a ditch. And inside that ditch were a series of post holes that probably held wooden posts in an upright manner, just sitting inside those posts, called the Aubrey holes. And then around 2400 BCE, the first stones were transported to the site. Now, these are smaller stones called the blue stones. And these blue stones seem to have come from the Preseli Mountains, which are about 250 kilometers away, over 150 miles from Stonehenge at the southwestern tip of Wales. Now, how these stones were transported to the site, nobody knows. Local legends say, of course, that it was the wizard Merlin that transported these stones from Ireland to erect Stonehenge. We know the stones didn't come from Ireland. Mineralogical examination of the stones indicate almost exactly which quarries in Wales they came from. But it's an interesting question as to why they transported the stones from such a long distance, especially at a time when everything would have been done by hand. So these are the early stones that were in place, these blue stones, but they are not the stones that we usually think of when we think of Stonehenge. When we usually think of Stonehenge, we think of all these very, very large sarsen stones that sit at the center of the circle. And the large sarsen stones seem to have been in place by about 2400 to 2100 BCE. And 2400 BCE, this is about contemporaneous with the pyramids in Egypt. So about the time the Egyptians were building the pyramids, the Bronze Age builders in southern England were building Stonehenge. The large sarsen stones were brought from a quarry which is 40 kilometers or about 25 miles away. And the smaller ones weighed 25 tons, and the larger stones weighed about 40 tons. And to put that in perspective, a fully loaded semi-truck will weigh about 40 tons. Now, there is one very well-known astronomical alignment in Stonehenge, and that is if you stand at the center of the circle, there is an avenue or alleyway, and sitting in that alleyway is a stone called the heel stone. And standing here at the center of the circle with north in this direction, on the day of the summer solstice, the sun rises over the heel stone. And it rises over the heel stone on only that day of the year, on the day of the summer solstice. So the heel stone is to the northeast of the center of the circle. And as you'll remember, during the course of the year, the rising position of the sun changes. On the equinox, it rises due east. And then every day on the spring equinox in March, it rises due east. And every day after that, it rises a little bit further and further and further northeast until the summer solstice. It rises at its maximum extent in the far northeast. And then day after that, the sun will rise further and further south. So this is what the alignment looks like. So here are the giant sarsen stones standing at the center of the circle on the morning of the summer solstice. If you look out over the heel stone, you will see the sun rising over the heel stone on the day of the summer solstice. Now, interestingly, we don't know whether that was the alignment that the ancients were interested in. There is some evidence that what they may have been interested in doing was standing at the heel stone and actually looking at sunset in the wintertime. So standing at the heel stone, looking back at the center of the circle, you also point to the furthest south that the sun sets in the wintertime. So either they were using this as a marker to mark the beginning of summer, or they were using it as a marker to mark the middle of or the beginning of winter when the sun is at its furthest south in the sky. And again, because they didn't leave us an instruction manual, we don't know what they were most interested in. And you can see some other things marked on here, other sunrises, sunsets, and then the various Aubrey holes in that ditch out there that held wooden posts that may or may not have been used in astronomical observations. So that is a little bit about Stonehenge. Why would they do this? Well, the answer, of course, is that the ancient peoples needed to keep calendars. So long before they had settled down with agriculture, they needed to know times of the year to hunt. They needed to keep track of the seasons. You can't always do that just by measuring the temperature outside or sensing how hot or cold it is. You need some other way to track the seasons so that you can plan ahead. Today, of course, we have our modern calendar hanging on our wall to do that, or on our computer, or on our phone. But in ancient times, the sky was their first calendar. And for most civilizations, the very first calendar was watching the rising and setting position of the sun as it changed throughout the years. Now, one of the enduring mysteries about Stonehenge is that we don't know how it was built. And lots of people have crazy ideas about how Stonehenge was built. That one of the more common ones that you will hear is that the technology was well beyond the technology of our ancestors. And I think the thing to keep in mind is I don't believe that for a minute. Stonehenge was built about 5,000 years ago. These sarsen stones were probably in place by about 4,500 years ago. But the people that lived 4,500 years ago were every bit as smart as you and I are. There's no evidence that human intelligence has significantly evolved in the last 4,500 years. We have the experience of 4,500 years of human technological development since the time of Stonehenge. But that said, they were very clever people. They were very smart people. We don't know how Stonehenge was constructed, but a number of people have tried. And
4,000
this
years
is the
ago,
story of
Stone
Wally
Age
Wallington, and how he has constructed his own version of Stonehenge. I don't believe that this is necessarily how Stonehenge was built, but it shows you what one person, being rather clever, can do.
Britons raised this mysterious monument, Stonehenge. Nobody knows how they did it, how they moved and stood these massive stones. It's a scientific mystery. This man swears he's cracked. He's building his own Stonehenge in his Flint, Michigan backyard to prove it. Wally Wallington's not a scientist, but he knows a thing or two about moving rocks.
That's a 300-pound block. This is a 1,600-pound block. Not too difficult.
He's a retired construction worker whose passion is moving heavy items. His feats always draw a crowd, mostly family.
I thought he was crazy. Who cares about moving blocks around? But then when you look at the magnitude of the weights that he's moving around, it is really impressive, and he's not using any equipment or anything.
In playing with blocks, Wally thinks he's discovered how Stonehenge was moved.
This is my first Stonehenge arch I permanently put in place. It's 3 blocks, they weigh over a ton each.
It's all based on a very simple technique.
I found a simple explanation for this, to move a block about the weight of a minivan, would be to place a stone underneath it. And once I balance on it, I can spin it. Of course, with that spin, you've seen I didn't go anywhere. But I got 2 handles on my lever, and I could place another stone on this side. Now, every time I spin a half rotation on each stone, I move the block horizontally, the distance between the stones. For my own output, I could move a 1-ton block 300 feet per hour.
Using this technique, he's moved everything from 1-ton blocks to buildings.
He moved up to a pole barn at one point, a 30 by 40 pole barn that he moved 300 feet for me. And it was more or less, what else can we move? And he looked at me and says, hey, can we move your barn? And I said, sure, let's, Next thing you know, it was 300 feet in the other direction onto another piece of property.
It can move barns, and Wally's betting it moves Stonehenge's 25-ton rocks. But raising these giants is a whole different puzzle.
This is 19,200 pounds. Yeah, it's 128 cubic feet of concrete.
Today, Wally hopes to solve it. He'll put one of his theories to the test and try to stand this 19,200-pound block by himself.
I've tried to do this without any mechanical machinery at all. I've used mostly sticks and stones for my equipment. No pulleys, no hoist, no metal levers. Just try to use gravity, too, I believe is my favorite tool. Whoop.
The first goal is getting this block 3 feet off the ground.
In order to move it up to this point, I just rock the block back and forth, adding weight to that end, and that opens a gap on this side, and just slide a board in. Then I add the weight to that end, there she goes, and slide a board in on this end.
This shoring box acts like a jack, slowly raising the block. It's 3 feet off the ground, but tomorrow is the big experiment. Standing it up. The grandkids have taken the day off school, and the cameras are rolling.
Hey, you guys watch Papa. He's going to do something wild.
They're here to watch Grandad lift a block the weight of 2 bulldozers.
It's ready.
Here's how it's supposed to work.
The first thing I'm going to do here is release this temporary shoring I have set and come over here, release some of my counterweights, and that's going to put the entire weight of the block on this rope. So then I'm going to release the rope, come back in, and the rope's going to be my brake. I'm going to guide it into the pit. The easiest way I can explain this is this is just a big teeter-totter, and I got the big kid on that end, and he's going to go down, and this end's going up.
He believes in his technique, but he's had some setbacks in the past.
One day I got thrown over top of a block, and a couple times I had the blocks roll off the top and almost land on my feet. One time I knocked myself out cold on the concrete, and so it's been challenging. Okay. Everybody ready? Yes! All right. Now just start spraying the sand. The sand will wash out and the block will start coming down.
Once the sand is washed from the pit, the block's own weight slowly stands it up.
Okay, finally, she's between the lines, guys. Looks good.
He did it.
Thank you, guys.
Raised a massive block using a technique so simple that Wally believes it must have been used to raise Stonehenge.
If they were to use this technique to raise the stones at Stonehenge, I believe they could have got it done with a lot smaller crew than anybody has imagined before.
It won't be long before this backyard is a little more crowded.
This is my first block in the circle. I plan to have 8 of them standing on end like that, all up 11 feet in height. The next one may be a little heavier. We're going to keep going a little further with it.
Until then, the only mystery that remains is this stone circle's name.
Wally's Wonder Circle.
How about the Wallington Circle?
What's that? Stonehenge Reloaded.
Ah, there you go.
Stonehenge Reloaded. There you go. That's not bad.
Now, I don't know that that is how Stonehenge was built. I doubt that it was built specifically like that, but it shows you that what one clever person can do using simple levers and simple machines. And so I think that how Stonehenge was constructed, even though we don't know the precise way that it was constructed, we certainly know that it could have been done by humans, and we don't need to resort to any supernatural explanations. All right, how about our next site? Our next site is Chichen Itza. So if you ever find yourself visiting the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, for example, you find yourself in Cancun or you find yourself in Cozumel, and you can make the trip, about a 2-hour trip from Cancun out to Chichen Itza, it is well worth the trip. So let's scan out here for a second and just show you. So over here we have Cozumel, that is Cancun up there. And as I said, about a 2-hour drive away from Cancun is Chichen Itza. Along the way, you can stop at the beautiful little city of Valladolid, and then you can stop at Chichen Itza, the famous ancient monuments of Chichen Itza. So Chichen Itza is an ancient Mayan site. And so let's go back to our lecture notes here. Chichen Itza was a major Mayan city on the Yucatan Peninsula. It was settled as early as the year 600 CE, but the major buildings, El Castillo, that we'll see here in a second, were put in place around 1000 CE. And another building, El Caracol, that we'll see, which is sometimes called the observatory. Both El Castillo and El Caracol have astronomical alignments. So let's talk about some of the astronomy at El Castillo, or the pyramid of Kukulkan, the sun god. So the pyramid has 4 sides to it, and each of the sides has 91 steps. 4 times 91 is 364. And when you get inside the top, the last step up to the altar makes 365 steps. So the steps leading up, leading into the altar, also equal the number of days in the year. Now, another interesting astronomical alignment, although I don't know that this one is really quite an astronomical alignment so much as they probably did design this, but it wasn't probably meant as a calendar marker, that is around the time of the equinoxes at sunset in March and September. If you look at the great staircase that leads up the side of El Castillo, you will notice that the side of the pyramid here is built in steps. And on the day of the equinox at sunset, as the sun is setting, the shadow that it casts creates this diamond pattern on the side of the staircase leading down to this snake's head right here. And the setting sun causes this pattern to move on the stairs, giving the impression that the snake is coming down the stairs. Now, the thing about this not being a true astronomical alignment is around the time of the equinox, for a few weeks before and a few weeks after the equinox, the alignment is good enough that you can see this around the time of sunset. It doesn't happen just on the day of the equinox. It happens a few weeks before and a few weeks after. So it probably isn't accurate enough to be used to set a calendar, but it does seem to have been purpose-built, and it isn't, I would call it an astronomical alignment, since the pyramid had to be aligned with the position of the sun on the equinoxes. A much more likely astronomical alignment at Chichen Itza is El Caracol, or the observatory. El Caracol is an ancient, probably domed structure, but certainly cylindrical structure. And inside there were a number of windows, and those windows were faced in particular directions so that an observer standing inside El Caracol could look out and they could see Venus at its maximum northern setting, Venus at its maximum southern setting. They could look at the equinox. There was probably an alignment with other stars. So El Caracol was probably used as an astronomical alignment, to check astronomical alignments. And the reason for the interest in Venus is that the Mayans had an incredibly complicated calendar that was based in part on the visibility of the planet Venus throughout the year. And so here is an example of an ancient stone monument where we have good evidence that they used it for astronomical observations, because we also have, in this case, written evidence of their astronomical observations. And that comes from a book called the Dresden Codex. Of all the Mayan books that were written over time, only 4 of them survive to us to this day. When European explorers first encountered the Mayans, they burned and destroyed most of their books. 4 of them, though, managed to make it to Europe and are preserved there, and one of them is called the Dresden Codex. And the Dresden Codex probably comes from the area of Chichen Itza, and it is largely a book of astronomical observations. Now, those observations are very much about setting calendars using observations of the planet Venus. And so here is a beautiful example where we have written evidence that the Mayans had a complicated calendar that made use of the observations of Venus, and a stone structure that seems to have intentional windows that are lined up with the locations where Venus would set and possibly rise, although this side of El Caracol is destroyed now, so we don't know what windows were over there. But this to me is a more likely example of a civilization doing astronomical observations using an observatory, because again, we have both physical and written evidence of their astronomy. Finally, the third place that I will talk about in your travels that you should visit is Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. It's in the Four Corners area of New Mexico. So Chaco Canyon has a number of spectacular ancient Anasazi buildings, Pueblo Bonito being one of the most significant and most important pueblos in all of the Americas. And there are a number of interesting astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon. There may be some building alignments, buildings that were aligned astronomically. But some of the more famous astronomical alignments are one is on a nearby butte. It's, so first of all, back to Chaco Canyon for a second. It's the largest collection of pueblos in the United States. It was a major ceremony and commerce center between 850 BCE and about 1250 CE. So Chaco Canyon was active around the same time. Certainly the height of the Anasazi were around the height of the Mayans down in southern Mexico and Central America. But Fajada Butte is a nearby butte. It's visible from Chaco Canyon. And on Fajada Butte, up near the top, there is a petroglyph in the wall, a carving, a rock carving. And there were a number of rocks placed vertically. And on the day of the summer solstice, sunlight would shine through these rocks and create a dagger of light called the sun dagger. And on the summer solstice, and only on the summer solstice, the sun dagger would cut through the center of this spiral pattern. So this may be an example of an ancient people using the summer solstice to set their calendar, to keep track of the seasons. And they did this by noting the summer solstice, creating a carving in the rock, and then coming back every year and watching the sun dagger and noting the day that it passes through the center of this spiral and using that as a marker of the solstices. Now, today, you're no longer allowed to climb to the top of Fajada Butte. It is considered to be sacred to Native Americans. And in addition, the amount of foot traffic up there actually damaged this alignment. Those 3 stones that used to line up and allow the sun dagger to be seen against the spiral on the summer solstice, those stones shifted because of all the foot traffic, and so you're no longer allowed up there to see the sun dagger. Also at Chaco Canyon is a famous pictograph. This is a pictograph. It's high up on a wall, well over your head, and it's a fascinating pictograph. It shows 3 things. It shows a bright star, it shows a crescent moon, and it shows a human hand. Now, we don't know what this pictograph symbolizes, the star, the moon, and the hand. But one of the ideas is that this may symbolize an event that happened in the night sky on July the 4th in the year 1054. On July the 4th in the year 1054, a new star became visible in the sky. Now, today we know it wasn't a new star at all. It was actually a dying star. It was the explosion of a massive star called a supernova explosion. That supernova exploded thousands of years earlier, but that light got to us. The light arrived. The light from that explosion arrived here on Earth on July 4th in the year 1054. We know the exact day that it arrived because Chinese astronomers kept meticulous records of the sky, and they report seeing a new star in the constellation that we know of as Taurus the Bull on July 4th in the year 1054. Today, when we look in that part of the sky, we see Messier 1, the Crab Nebula. It's the exploded remains of a massive star. We call these remains a supernova explosion. When massive stars reach the end of their lives and they run out of fuel, they detonate themselves in a titanic explosion. These supernovae are so bright that they can be visible in the daytime sky for a month, and they can be visible in the nighttime sky for many, many years. Now, because the Chinese kept such good records, we were able to use, or archaeoastronomers were able to use the Chinese records of the day and time to predict where the supernova was and where the crescent moon was. And it turns out the supernova occurred in the sky not far from the crescent moon. And the timing of it in the year 1054 is the time when the Anasazi people were at their height. And so it's just possible that this pictograph that we are looking at is a representation of the supernova in 1054. What's fascinating about the supernova in 1054 is that in Europe it wasn't recorded at all. We have no records from Europe of the supernova. It was the middle of the Dark Ages in Europe, but at the same time, we have quite a bit of history from that period in time. So it's not clear whether European astronomers just didn't notice it, or was it particularly cloudy at that time, Were there other events that prevented astronomers across Europe from seeing it? We don't know, but it was seen by Chinese astronomers. It was possibly seen by the Anasazi, but it was not seen by European observers. The last one that I will talk about is shows a little bit of the dangers of archaeoastronomy, and that's the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel probably dates to the years 1500 to 1750 CE. It is a series of stones laid out on a mountaintop in western Wyoming, and it's called the Medicine Wheel. And there are probably some astronomical alignments here. So, for example, in this direction across here, across the middle of the medicine wheel, we have the summer solstice sunset. So that is standing at this pile of rocks and looking over the center, you're looking right towards the summer solstice sunset. So that's the sunset on the summer solstice. That also means if you're standing here and looking backwards, you would see the sun rise on the winter solstice. But that's one possible alignment. Here's the summer solstice sunrise, which means looking along that direction, you would see the winter solstice sunset. So those are two almost certain astronomical alignments. We have very good evidence that Native Americans did use observations of the sun for calendar purposes. The danger with the medicine wheel is there are other piles of rocks and there are other spokes on the wheel that we don't know what they were used for. And various astronomers and archaeoastronomers over the years have looked at these piles of rocks and they've said, look, if you stand on this pile and look over this pile, you see the bright star Rigel when it rises. And if you stand on this pile and look over this pile, you see the bright star Sirius. Or if you stand here and look over this pile, you see the bright star Aldebaran where it rises. It is possible that the Native Americans used these star alignments. We just have no other evidence for it. We don't have evidence in anything written. We don't have anything in oral histories that they used star alignments like that. And so I think these are highly speculative. I think this is a case of archaeoastronomers in some cases run amok. I do think the solar alignments are significant, but I think other than the sun, because we have no corroborating written or oral records, and nothing from Native American tradition that says that these particular alignments were important, to me it's highly speculative as to whether these alignments were actually used by the people who built the medicine wheel in Wyoming. So those are just some important ancient astronomical sites around the world. As you travel the world, I hope you take the opportunity to visit some of these sites. And that's where we're going to leave it here today, because I want to get on to talking about the history of Western astronomy. That is the kind of astronomy that we largely practice today. It is the Greek astronomy is the foundations for the later history of astronomy that we will study in the Renaissance, and so we will start with that in our next lecture. Thank you very much for joining me on this exploration of some historical astronomical monuments, and I will see you in my next lecture on the history of Greek astronomy.